if your gut microbiome could talk, what's the one thing it would say to people that they're doing wrong? And what do you think is the one thing that maybe people are doing right?
Yeah, I would say if it could talk, I think it would encourage people by saying, feed me. The microbiome is desperate for the right kind of nutrition, not only for propagating its own health, not only for improving diversity, but that's how the microbiome in large part impacts us. Right? What we feed the microbes don't just become an energy source for them, but it becomes a substrate or starting material for critical compounds that we need to exist that we cannot make ourselves. Right? So underfeeding the microbiome the right type of nutrition is probably one of the biggest mistakes we make as a population. That goes all the way to all the bad dietary choices and all that, right? So one of the big impacts of ultra processed foods, and we can get into like the seed oils and all these little ingredients and all that might harm people. But the bigger impact of that is that it's a low fiber, low polyphenol, poor microbiome diet, right? That has a bigger impact than whatever the flavorings and compounds in there that might be in there that could harm you. So I'd say the microbiome's doing that, or calling out for that, calling out to be fed appropriately. I would say one of the things we're doing correctly is we are starting to pay attention to the impact of the microbes, right? These microbes, for the better part of human existence and modern science, has been completely invisible to us. And it's not hyperbole to say that they control the vast majority of our functionality. So, there's been some estimates that it's about 80 to 90% of all our metabolic and biochemical functions are either influenced or directly controlled by the microbiome, in part because we are wholly inadequate with our genetics, right? We have only 22,000 genes. And someone who doesn't know genetics may say, well, that sounds like a lot of genes. Keep in mind that a cockroach has about 22,000 genes and an earthworm has about 30,000 genes, right? So we're not that sophisticated in our genetics, but we have 2.5 million microbial genes in our system. So that just starts to tell you where a lot of the information comes from in terms of protein synthesis and enzymatic function and metabolic function and all that. It comes from this reservoir of microbes. So that one of the things we are doing correctly, thank goodness, finally, is we're paying attention to this invisible universe within us that controls us.
So let's talk about feeding those bacteria. That's the prebiotic. Can a person actually get enough prebiotic fibers in eating a diet that's talked about, a whole foods diet, okay, by eating fruits, vegetables, polyphenols? Or do really people need to take some type of prebiotic fibers because they just can't get that in diet? What's your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I would say a couple things on that. Number one, I think if somebody is incredibly diligent, they could eat enough prebiotics and fibers in general just from diet alone in order to achieve their goals, right? The ability to do that exists. The problem with it is the ability to quantify that you're doing it correctly, right? That's where it becomes complicated. So I'll tell people what I do, right? Because to me, that's one of the most important aspects of the diet. And when you look at your diet and the prebiotics, fibers, and all that, let's break down a little bit for people what components are most important there, right? So we have these terms that are kind of commingled, prebiotics and fiber. Now, most prebiotics are fiber, but not all fiber are prebiotics, right? So that's a distinguishing factor we have to do. So prebiotics are often much more smaller molecules that are far more complex, like some of the most common ones that people know of are like inulin. You might hear of that as a non-nutritive or healthy sweetener, for example, in things, or oligosaccharides. Some people have heard of that, like fructooligosaccharides or galactooligosaccharides that are found in certain supplements and all that. Those are very complex carbohydrate structures that only a certain set of microbes can metabolize. So the thing about prebiotics is they are a specialized component of fiber that specifically feeds certain genre of microbes. And often the genre are the really important keystone species. So that said, we definitely need to get adequate amounts of prebiotics, but you don't need a lot in terms of prebiotics. 2 to 3 grams per day tends to be enough of prebiotics. Now, the bigger side of it is the fiber part of it, right? So now fiber is distinguished in that it's not as complex in terms of carbohydrate structure as prebiotics are. But what's important about fiber is that we cannot break it down, right? We cannot digest fiber. We cannot extract nutrients out of fiber. It basically moves through our small bowel into the large bowel where it ends up going through fermentation. Now, within fiber, there's two different types. There's soluble fiber and insoluble fiber. Soluble fiber, of course, being one that can solubilize in water, meaning it's going to bind water and form a gel in your gut. And I'll talk about what the benefits of that are. And then insoluble fiber doesn't bind water. And in fact, it kind of pushes things through, much more rapidly than soluble fiber does. So what is the proportion? You normally want to get somewhere around 70% of your fiber intake as soluble fiber, and you want to get about 30%, 25 to 30% as insoluble. That's very general, right? Part of it depends on how your bowels move, right? So here's a general rule of thumb. Soluble fiber slows down your bowels. Insoluble fiber speeds up your bowels. So if you're somebody that, it doesn't poop regularly, and the intervals between bowel movements tend to be really long, like 24 hours, 30 hours plus, and you feel more constipated usually, you actually probably want to then tilt more towards the the insoluble fiber. If you're somebody that has normal bowel movements, whether it's once a day regularly, twice a day regularly, but it's fairly regular, the bowel movements tend to be fairly healthy, then you want to do the 70% soluble fiber. Or if you're somebody that has diarrhea and tends to have too fast of a bowel movement, you lean towards soluble fiber, right? So that's just general rules. So you want to get prebiotics, a couple of grams a day. You want to get fiber. Now, how much fiber? That's the really key important thing. Now, fiber is one of the most well-studied macronutrients there is in our food system. Some recent meta-analysis studies around that involve over 1 million patients. And many, many years, like 36 million patient visits, data points and all that, show that for every 10 grams of fiber, this is a combination of soluble and insoluble, you add to your daily diet, you reduce your all-cause mortality, that's dying from any disease, by 10%, right? For every 10 grams. And that's up to about 40 grams of fiber. After that, the effect starts to taper off a little bit. So to me, everyone's goal should be 2 to 3 grams of prebiotics, upwards of 40 grams of fiber per day. And then on top of that, you need to add polyphenols, right? So that's the general rule. Now, just from me saying all that, I think people kind of start to understand, but it's like, holy shit, how do I keep up with this, right?
Sure.
And this is where supplementation can become useful, right? So I end up supplementing around 20 grams of fiber per day. And feeling pretty comfortable that with the rest of my diet from food, I'm getting at least another 20. If you go over 40, there's no issue at all. I just want to make sure I'm hitting my 40.
No, that's cool. And that's a good number. So that 40, and like you, like I do a good regular whole foods diet. I mean, I'm eating probably 8 to 9 to 12 servings of vegetables a day. But from what you're saying, I'm probably not quite at that fiber source there. So I should be supplementing. So we fed, or we're creating a food source for our bacteria. Let's kind of jump into the bacteria themselves. So as I went to pharmacy school and I learned, there's all these lactobacillus species and bifidobacteria, and most people understand those. That's like probiotics 101, right? I know there's some beneficial yeast. We could talk about that a little later. But something I know you have a lot of expertise in is spore-based probiotics. What makes a spore different than like a live, like lactobacillus? How does that look differently in terms of a product if you're going to supplement with it?
Yeah. One of the big problems I had when I started getting into the world of probiotics and researching probiotics, and the reason I actually even got into it is there was a big CPG brand that had hired my research company to start understanding what like some of the competitors are doing with probiotics, right? Because where probiotics were going at that time, so this was in around 2012, 2013, was that every new probiotic that was being launched was just more strains and more CFU counts. Like everyone on the shelf was trying to compete with 20 billion, 30 billion, 50 billion, right? And so the question was, is that the right approach? Is that really what is validated by science. And what about the species that are being used? Lactobacillus bifidobacteria were the most common. So as I started digging into this from the perspective of a microbiologist, a lot of it started to really not stand up, and it didn't make sense at all to me, because number one, it is very unusual, and I, as a microbiologist, I'm always thinking as an evolutionary biologist as well. Like almost anything that I think could be beneficial, especially if we're trying to mimic something natural, then there has to be some sort of evidence that we naturally encountered these things through the course of human development, right? So my first lens of looking at the conventional probiotics was, is it normal to encounter 30, 40, 50 billion CFUs of lacto and bifido of these particular species on a daily basis when we look at the course of human development? And it became very clear that no, you don't, right? So most of those species, where you get them from in your gut microbiome is you get them from mom during the birthing process, and then close interaction with mom, dad, other family members in the first few years of life. Once your microbiome is set around 2 to 3 years old, after that, you're really interacting with microbes in the environment, and then you're interacting with microbes from one another that we get that could potentially influence our microbiome. But we don't, consume 60, 70 billion CFUs of these various lacto and bifido strains. So that already looked a little bit strange to me. Then when you dig into the literature, what became clear is that there's no real scientific validation for going more and more and more in terms of the counts of the number of strains and the CFU count. The vast majority of product studies are done on a single species at like 1 to 2 or 2 to 3 billion CFUs, right? So this whole idea of we need to go 40 billion, 50 billion, all that didn't make sense. Then there was a university out of Israel that published 2 studies on recovering the microbiome after antibiotics. And they used these, what I call kitchen sink-like probiotic formulas that had 15, 20 species in it, had 30, 40, 50 billion. And what they actually showed was that the recovery of the microbiome was slowed down by introducing this hodgepodge of bacteria, right? That further validated what my line of thinking was. And then finally, later on, I also got to do some work with University College Cork and some of the researchers there. And they had done some research showing that many of these strains are actually quite inflammatory. They do trigger an inflammatory response in most individuals because they're foreign species. The body doesn't recognize them as self. The microbes in your gut, your endogenous microbes, don't recognize them as self. And so they can trigger a pretty massive amount of inflammation throughout the system. And so adding 50 billion of those in your system every day doesn't necessarily help you. Now, that's not to say that there aren't any really useful lacto and bifido species. There are some amazing ones who do very specific things, and you just basically need to take them by themselves. So I took a completely different conventional approach to probiotics, and I said, okay, what is our normal way evolutionarily to encounter microbes, right, after we're born and we're seeded and so on? The clear answer is through the environment. Our ancestors ate dirt, and they were in the drinking waters out of rivers and streams and foraging for food and digging and things like that. So we started looking at the environment and started to understand what microbes within the environment could actually play a role as a probiotic. And then how we define a probiotic is also really important, because a probiotic is a live microorganism. When administered in adequate amounts, can confer a health benefit to the host. So number one, whatever microbe we looked at as a probiotic has to survive through the gastric system, right? Which, as you know well, is called a gastric barrier, because part of its role is designed to kill stuff. So we don't get infected by potentially spoiled food and so on. And so any microbe in the environment that we were going to utilize as a probiotic has to have a natural ability to survive through the gastric system. And that's where the spores came in. Because Bacillus endospores have this methodology of putting a armor-like coating around themselves, which makes them impervious to things like stomach acid and all that. And then once they get into the lining of the gut, the small bowel, they bust out of that armor-like coating and they become a fully functioning probiotic bacteria for you in your gut. But we also wanted to ensure that the ones we were using are native to the gut. That's another important feature, because you can get Bacillus endospores from all over the place. and they've never been in the human gut and they don't know what to do in the human gut, right? So the ones that are native to the gut are super intelligent. They understand what the microbiome is supposed to look like, and they confer all kinds of changes. So that's the general idea behind like why a spore is really unique compared to what I call the kitchen sink probiotics, right? Like throw a whole bunch of stuff in there and we're so many billions.
No, that's a great analogy because I feel like even today, and I mean, most of your like longevity and wellness people, clinicians, we get it, but a lot of the traditional person just don't understand what a spore is. So that's a great explanation. You brought up something that's kind of funny because every pharmacist in pharmacy school is taught when you give a probiotic, you should give, when you give an antibiotic, you should give a probiotic, which I've been recommending that forever. And then I came across that exact study that you've talked about that actually showed there's negativity in giving a probiotic, traditional lactobifidobacterium. So in your eyes, obviously newer science, there's a potential to give beneficial yeast, or there's also the ability to give spores. Which one of those two, I'm kind of putting you in a weird spot here because I know what you do for a living. Which one of those, in your opinion, probably is most beneficial for somebody who's actually on an antibiotic per se?
Yeah, I think if you cannot get the right spores, and I'll talk about what the right spores would be, then I would absolutely use a yeast like a Saccharomyces boulardii, which is fantastic and also has tons of studies on recovering the gut after enduring antibiotics, right? And it makes a lot of sense because they are impervious to the antibiotic, being a yeast, and the antibiotic being specific of a bacteria. They acidify the gut, and that's one of the big profound factors of what antibiotics do, to help people understand. So, we always talk about antibiotics kind of wiping out the gut, right? But it's a little bit of a misnomer because obviously it doesn't sterilize the gut and then like you have no more bacteria in there. Basically what it's doing is it's knocking down the population of all of the microbes by up to 90%, depending on the antibiotic, right? Which means that you still have a representation of every bacteria that lives in your gut, but you've got only about 10% of each of those cells. Now, the benefit of bacteria is that they grow back very quickly, right? The problem is the proportions in which they grow back alter with every dose. And why? So there's a couple of different reasons, but one of the most common reason is because the gut is heavily controlled by pH, right? Acidity is a very important thing within the gut. Of course, the stomach is super acidic, and then the proximal part of the small bowel is more acidic than the distal part of the small bowel. But nonetheless, the pH tends to be more acidic than neutral or basic. And that acidity comes from the production of lactic acid by lactic acid producing bacteria. So they play a very important role in managing what that ecosystem looks like by keeping the pH lower. Most of the pathogens, the gram-negative bacteria, the candida type of pathogens, they all like to have a higher pH, right? They do better at a slightly higher pH. So what's happening with the antibiotics? So let's say you have a balanced, healthy microbiome. You've got all of these bugs in there that are producing lactic acid. That's controlling the potential pathogens and the fungal sources and all that. Now comes an antibiotic. A couple hours it's sitting in the bowel. Many antibiotics take about 2.5 hours to clear the small bowel and enter into hepatic circulation. And so in that time, it's knocking down everything by upwards of 90%. Including all the lactic acid producing microbes, right? So now you're not producing lactic acid, the pH of the gut starts to creep up. And in that slightly higher pH, the dysfunctional microbes are favored to come back faster, right? Then the next dose, boom, knocks everything down further again. The pH creeps up a little bit more, and more of the dysfunctional microbes come back fast. So the good microbes are still there. It's just their numbers with each dose reduces overall. So something like a Saccharomyces boulardii comes through, it's impervious to the antibiotic, and it's making lactic acid and maintaining that lower pH in the gut and allowing those good microbes to bounce back better, right? Now, the spores do that too. And in fact, I found that we created a product called Restore Flora. And the reason we created it is we found actually that the combination of the Saccharomyces boulardii and the bacillus spores was the best. And we had published a study on that. And the reason why it's the best is two things. Number one, the Saccharomyces boulardii with the pH management, fantastic. Spores also produce lactic acid, so it adds to that effect. The other thing the spores do that's really great is competitive exclusion. So if there are overgrowing dysfunctional microbes, they can actually find them sit next to them, and then bring their numbers down specifically, right? It's like a really intelligent antimicrobial that only seeks out dysfunctional microbes. So the combination is probably the best solution.
Got it. I knew you'd have a great answer, and I really enjoyed that explanation because I think there's just a lot of people that have no clue how complicated all that is. So that's really, really awesome. So we brought the good species in. We fed them with, like you said, fibers, prebiotics, polyphenols. Now let's talk about postbiotics and the role they play on maintaining that gut health. What is a postbiotic, and does it have effect in the gut only, or does it have effect throughout the whole entire body?
Yeah, so there's a couple of different definitions of postbiotics. So there's an FDA regulatory definition, and then there's what I would call the common definition that I'd say most researchers and people in the world of the microbiome and health use. So I'll give you the FDA definition first. So the FDA definition of a postbiotic is actually a dead bacteria that has a metabolic effect, right? And that's just how they have, from a regulatory perspective, distinguished between probiotics and then probiotics that can be dead and still have an effect. Because the true scientific definition of a probiotic is a live microorganism. But then studies started coming out and showing, well, some probiotics, even when they're dead, have a beneficial function. They said, that's a new category. It's called postbiotics. Most people, though, refer to postbiotics as byproducts of probiotic or bacterial metabolomics. So metabolization of food, right? So what the bacteria in your gut actually produce. Some of the most well-known things are short-chain fatty acids like butyrate, acetate, propionate. Of course, they produce enzymes. They produce methylated B vitamins. They produce neurotransmitters, right? They produce really important compounds like urolithin A. They produce like a whole pharmacy of compounds that are really important for our functionality. And to answer your question about whether they function in the gut or they go beyond the gut, some of those postbiotics are very much gut-focused functionality. Take butyrate, for example. Butyrate is a short-chain fatty acid that's made by some groups of microbes like Rhamnococcus and Faecalibacter prosnitzi and so on. It comes from fermenting fibers. That's one of the massive benefits of fiber, is that you get butyrate out of it. Now, butyrate becomes the primary fuel for colonocytes, for the cells that make up the lining of the colon. So that helps those cells turn over, repair, function, and so on. Butyrate also becomes fuel for the immune cells that are in the mucosa, which is, and keep in mind that mucosa in the gut is a massive surface area. It's almost 4,000 square feet. It's massive, right? So there's a lot of immune cells in there, a lot of monitoring going on, lots of energy needed. Butyrate becomes a very important form of that energy. Butyrate also works in the gut to help us control our metabolism. Butyrate plays a very important role in insulin sensitivity, insulin response, and upregulating satiety hormones and so on. And then butyrate also plays a very important role in immune sampling. Which is where the immune cells in your gut are sampling all of the antigens that are coming through and trying to figure out what it should attack and what it shouldn't attack. Butyrate becomes a very important context for that sampling. So butyrate is an example of something that predominantly stays in the gut, but plays really vital roles in the gut. Now, the other short-chain fatty acids, especially acetate, is one that does a little bit of work in the gut, but then leaves the gut and goes to the rest of the body. I actually have a U.S. patent on the upregulation of acetate to reduce acne lesions. And we did 2 studies on this. And the second study was the largest probiotic acne study ever done. And what we showed was about a 75% reduction in acne lesions in a 12-week period, as good as any antibiotic, the normal ones that are used for acne. Of course, with no side effects or only health benefits. And the reason for that is because acetate leaves the gut, goes into the peripheral tissues. It can get into areas like the sebaceous gland, and it can reduce inflammation in the sebaceous gland, reduce sebum production, and reduce inflammation in the pores as well, right? So it has that kind of effect. Then you've got other postbiotics that not only make it, throughout the body, but they go into our cells and feed our mitochondria, like urolithin A. Urolithin A is a very important postbiotic made from the conversion of polyphenols from the diet into this compound. And this compound is one of those most important ones that fixes our mitochondria and helps the mitochondria turn over, which again are the little energy, the engines of our cells, right? And aging, in fact, can be very well described as a continuous and progressive disruption of our mitochondria. So urolithin and that as a postbiotic may be one of the things that is really important for aging, as anti-aging, which is probably why there's all of this great research on the anti-aging and longevity benefits of drinking things like green tea, black tea, and so on, because teas tend to be really high in polyphenols, right? So that there's many categories of postbiotics, and they're all critically important. And one more note about postbiotics: most of these compounds are so important for our functionality, right? Just think about urolithin A. The energy sources of our cells, the engines of our cells, depend on this compound, and we cannot make that compound ourselves, right? That's how much we've outsourced to the microbes to produce these critical things for us. So those postbiotics are really, at the end of the day, how the microbiome affects our health.
Yeah, and I think you just drew a great picture. If we don't feed those bacteria right, they don't produce the right things, it doesn't just affect the gut, it affects the body, and that's how that all goes in. Let's talk about when things in the gut go wrong. You mentioned this important butyrate and colonocytes and all that aspect. Let's talk about something called leaky gut, which probably 10, 15 years ago we couldn't have said, but now it's pretty well recognized as far as that goes. The way it was explained to me is it's this low-grade inflammation that leaky gut causes over time. As a pharmacy school, I learned about septicemia, which is a blood infection that can kill you pretty quickly. But really, the way I see what you call the low-grade leaky gut and that overinflammation you can talk about, it's like a chronic low-grade inflammation over time that will kill you. Tell me about leaky gut and that impact that gut health and that gut lining barrier plays such a big role in our overall health.
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned the funny dichotomy that we couldn't mention that term, and you'd get laughed at in places. But I actually was privileged to write a chapter in this particular textbook. So this is from Springer Health, which is a reference textbook, and on endotoxemia specifically, which is of course the clinical impact of leaky gut. And the reason you mentioned septicemia, and that's really important to note, because that plays a couple of big roles in this, right? And that it kind of speaks to why this is such a big issue for the body. It's also the reason why gastroenterologists and doctors never believed that leaky gut could exist, because their whole position was that if the gut was leaky, you would be getting septic all the time and people would be dying left and right. What they did not understand was this low-grade permeability that could occur, right? So to put that in context for people, the barrier system of the intestinal tract, especially the small bowel, is a very interesting system because it is a selectively permeable barrier, right? The skin is way less selectively permeable. The skin is a much more hardy brick wall-like barrier. But the lining of the gut is a much smaller, thinner barrier. In fact, from a cell standpoint, it's only one cell thick of these intestinal cells, the intestinal epithelial cells that are standing kind of shoulder to shoulder. If you think about like a line of soldiers that are trying to protect a castle, right? They're standing shoulder to shoulder in a single line, and anything that has to enter the castle, whether it's food and rations and all that, have to make their way past these soldiers. But in front of the soldiers, because there's only one line of soldiers, they wanted something to help them. In front of them, they put a moat, and in that moat is just a really viscous river that just slows down how long it takes things to get to that line of soldiers. So then that way, the soldiers and then the people behind the soldiers that are monitoring what's coming through, which in our case is the immune system, can look at the things coming through that really viscous that really viscous moat and decide and have time to decide how to deal with it, right? Is that friend? Is that foe? Is that nutrition that we should let through? And so on. So there's a complexity to this. Now, that viscous moat that I'm talking about is something called the mucus layer, the mucin layer on our intestines. So we have this mucin layer. Sitting below that mucin layer are those intestinal epithelial cells, which are the soldiers. And then below that, are you truly inside the body? Because now you're going into circulation into the liver, and some of it through the rest of the body as well. So think about the role that that barrier system needs to play. It has to let nutrients through, right? It has to let fats and amino acids and vitamins and all that stuff through, but it also doesn't want to let food particles through, undigested food particles. It doesn't want to let microbes through. It doesn't want to let any sort of pollutants that come in through the food through. So it has to have that selective permeability. The thing of it is, all of the checkpoints of that, right? And so that viscous moat, and the structure of that viscous moat, which is really important. And then those soldiers standing shoulder to shoulder, and as they're standing shoulder to shoulder, they have linked their arms together. So think about the linking between those cells as being as being a very important selective checkpoint, because the shoulders can unlink their arms, open up a small gap to let important things through, and then they relink their arms. In the case of our body, that link is called a tight junction, right? There's about 40 proteins that kind of stitch the cells together. And so the tight junction proteins, the structure and the function of the mucosa, the immune cells that are present in that area monitoring everything, all of those things are highly dependent on microbes and upregulation and functionality from the microbes, right? Just like how we don't have the capability of making urolithins that I talked about, we don't have the capability of upregulating our tight junction repair or the production of the mucus, right? We need the postbiotics, we need the signals from the microbes in order to do all that. And so what leaky gut really is some breakdown of that barrier system. Often it's a shrinking of that moat, so that mucus layer gets shrunk because of dysfunctional microbes eating away at that mucus layer, and the beneficial microbes that help rebuild it, their numbers being too low. So you get a net shrinking of that mucus. So imagine that moat shrinks. And then the linking arms between the soldiers, the tight junctions, also start to fall apart, and that leaves an opening gap, right? Now, the thing that doctors couldn't understand is that your bowel is like 28 feet, right? When you just look at the small intestine alone, it's like 20-something feet. You can have this leakiness and this dysfunction in 5 inches of your bowel, right? And it's very subclinical. You probably won't have any sort of outcomes from it, but it's a progressive problem unless it's fixed. So that 5 inches becomes 15 inches, and then becomes 2-3 feet, then becomes 8 feet, 10 feet, right? So the more of your bowel that is leaky, the more impactful the clinical effect of that leakiness is. And this is why we can be subclinical, meaning no symptoms, and walking around with leaky gut for years. However, as it progresses and it builds, it's going to cause issues. And I'll just state, and we'll jump into more explanation, but one of the most clinically impactful things that ends up leaking through is something called LPS, lipopolysaccharide, right? This LPS is a component of a type of bacteria in your gut called gram-negative bacteria. All bacteria in the gut can be categorized as gram-negative or gram-positive. The gram-negative bacteria don't have a cell wall, but they do have a cell membrane with this LPS in it. And when that bacteria dies, and bacteria is constantly dying and regenerating in the gut, it releases that LPS, and that LPS is sitting there in that moat, in that mucin layer. If that mucin layer gets degraded and the barrier system is compromised, then that LPS leaks through and ends up in the liver and in circulation. That is called metabolic endotoxemia, and that is the clinical impact of leaky gut. And then we can talk about what all that LPS does in the body, right? That's where things really get interesting.
All that negative downstream. So you talked about that complex system, how we keep our gut intact. I want to talk about something that I think affects everybody, that not only a bad diet does, we know many of the food triggers that cause that, but that's stress. When you hear stress kills you, I think one of the things it is that effect of that. How does stress and all that affect all that science that you just talked about?
Yeah. And I think one of the most brilliant observations, even, from old wives' tales and all that, is that stress kills you, right? I think starting in around 2015, that became very clear from research that was coming out. In fact, there was a 2015 meta-analysis kind of a paper. It was not quite a meta-analysis. It was almost like a prospective paper that was written by researchers that reviewed a bunch of science around the impact of stress on the gut. And here's what they concluded. right? And it was very well founded in the paper. They concluded that stress-induced endotoxemia, that's leaky gut, and then the leaking in of that LPS endotoxin, was the number one cause of mortality and morbidity worldwide, right? It's the number one cause of death worldwide, right? And that sounds crazy. It sounds really hyperbolic. But when you think about it and you look at it and you go, okay, what are the biggest killers of us? Well, heart disease, right? Diabetes, Alzheimer's, cancers, all of those conditions, all the top 8, 10 killers of humans, especially in the westernized world, all of them have leaky gut, endotoxemia as either a root cause or something that progresses the condition even further, right? And so it became quite reasonable to think that stress really does kill. So why is that? Well, there's a few different things. Number one, when you're stressed and you activate the flight or fight response, of course, cortisol increases, right? Cortisol is the thing that's facilitating the whole fight or flight response. It's a stress hormone that most people know of. And then epinephrine, norepinephrine is also kicking in. One of the things that cortisol does is cortisol actually increases permeability in the lining of the gut, right? So multiple bouts of cortisol exposure throughout the day. And I'm talking about unusual cortisol exposure, right? Because we all have a natural cortisol pattern, which our gut can deal with and it'll repair itself. But if you keep spiking cortisol throughout the day and it's hard for it to come down, it'll have a net negative effect on the gut microbiome and create more leakiness. So it makes the gut more permeable. At the same time, the other thing that cortisol and the stress response does is it increases the growth of pathogens within the gut. Now, the reason it does that is there's a lot of opportunistic pathogens within the gut. Most pathogens in the gut are considered to be opportunistic. Now, what does that mean? It means that they don't actually activate their pathogenic capability until there's the right opportunity. Right? Now, why do they do that? Well, because the gut is a very complex ecosystem. There's a lot of competition, and there's an immune system surveying the whole thing. And so these microbes are smart enough to know that under the wrong condition, if they all of a sudden start making a noise and kicking up, their toxins and so on, either the other microbes in the space will compete and shut them down, or the other microbes and the immune system would do that. So they look for the right opportunity. And what some of these microbes have come to realize is when the host is under stress, which they are measuring your epinephrine, norepinephrine inflammation levels. When the host is under stress, that's when the immune system is compromised. And as a result of that, that's the right time to kick off its toxigenic genes and proliferate, right? So multiple bouts of stress are like taking little doses of antibiotics, allowing these dysfunctional microbes to grow as the gut is becoming more and more leaky, right? Now, the crazy thing about it is it becomes a self-perpetuating cycle, because as the gut becomes more leaky and the more these pathogens start to grow, it makes you actually even more susceptible to stress, because that throws off your autonomic nervous system, your gut-brain axis. That makes you lean more towards a sympathetic autonomic nervous system rather than the parasympathetic. And most people have heard that the sympathetic is the fight or flight and the parasympathetic is the rest and digest, right? So it becomes a self-perpetuating cycle. This is why it's a progressive condition that gets worse and worse over time, right? If someone doesn't intervene significantly in their stress pattern, their tolerance levels and their amplification of the stress and their inability to come down from their fight or flight response becomes worse over time because of the self-perpetuating cycle.
Very cool. So cortisol is a sex hormone. Let's talk about sex hormones in general. How is a woman's microbiome different than a man's microbiome? What does that look like? And especially different times of their life. How does that change?
Yeah, women have a very important compound that, as it turns out, has an amazing effect on the microbiome, and that's estrogen. Of course, men have estrogen as well, but our levels are so low that it doesn't impact the microbiome in any significant way. And estrogen, you can think of estrogen as both an anti-inflammatory in the gut, but also a prebiotic. So estrogen actually feeds microbes in the gut and maintains diversity, right? So estrogen, once it's made and circulated and binds all the estrogen receptors and does its job, because based on her cycle, she has to get rid of estrogen, right? And estrogen is detoxed through the gut microbiome, through phase 1, phase 2 detox, and then ends up in the liver where it ends up getting conjugated. And that conjugation term is important because it basically takes estrogen and puts a cloak on it so it doesn't look like estrogen anymore. Then that conjugated form is dumped into the gut and is supposed to either get metabolized or move through defecation, right? So that's the normal cycle. Now, that process helps feed certain microbes and maintain a balance within the microbiome. Now, if a woman's gut starts to become dysfunctional, like she has an overgrowth of certain types of E. coli or gram-negative bacteria, one of the things that they can do is uncloak too much of that estrogen, causing a problem of estrogen dominance. And that's actually one of the most prevalent hormone dysfunctions in young age, birth. What's the word I'm thinking of? Where during their fertile stages, right? So when prior to perimenopause, when women are of childbearing age, that's a term I'm trying to think of. So what tends to happen is women's gut become dysbiotic. They get an overgrowth of gram-negative bacteria. That gram-negative bacteria is increasing the amount of estrogen they're reabsorbing into their circulation. And often it's not the right type of estrogen. It's not the right form of estrogen, right? You've got estradiol, estriol, 16-OH, 4-OH. So it's absorbing the wrong types of estrogen that can create more risk in the individual. So that's estrogen dominance, and that's one way in which estrogen flows through. But under normal conditions, estrogen is very beneficial for the gut and helps maintain diversity in the gut microbiome. Men start to see a shrinking of the diversity much sooner, which is one of the reasons why we become more susceptible to things like heart disease and all that earlier than women do, right? But then in perimenopause and menopause, women catch up to us in terms of their risk for heart disease and osteoporosis and all that. And there's evidence that one of the reasons they catch up is because there's a significant shift in their microbiome in that stage. And one of the drivers of that shift is their declining levels of estrogen. So now they have less estrogen going through their gut microbiome, which actually shrinks the diversity of their gut microbiome, creates even more leaky gut. And that dysfunction increases endotoxemia, and their endotoxemia levels start to catch up with men. And so thereby their heart disease risk and metabolic health risk and all that go up at that stage.
Wow.
Right?
So I guess with all the new push for hormone replacement, which is now quote unquote a little safer, which it's always has been, we can see the real benefit in terms of gut health. That's another aspect of it as far as it goes.
One more thing that changes. So we also know that leaky gut and endotoxemia has a massive impact on joint health and pain receptors and all that throughout the body. So there's all these studies that show that between the age of 45 and 60, when you compare men to women, women report new pain, joint dysfunction, and all that 10 times more frequently than men, right? And between the age of 35 to 50, there's a linear increase in the reporting of musculoskeletal pain among women. So women who are 40 versus 50, the 50-year-old women experience 2 times more musculoskeletal pain, right? So that pain and that joint degeneration, all of that stuff starts to come about because of that increase in leaky gut, that reduction in estrogen, that loss of diversity, and increase in endotoxemia.
Yeah, I love that analogy. And this ties into one last thing I was going to talk about is that you're right, that endotoxemia keeps that low-grade inflammation. We see the markers, HSCRP goes up. And the way I see it is somewhere there's a chink in the armor, whether it be genetics, it's going to show up as cognitive health, cardiovascular health. It's going to show up as aches and pains. But the other thing, people walk in my pharmacy all the time is like, Steve, I've been under stress and I have this rash and I don't know what's going on with my skin. Tell me about the gut-skin connection, because there's definitely one there.
Yeah, absolutely. So that's been a very focused area for me in the last couple of years. So the gut-skin connection is really important because obviously one of the things people have to wrap their head around is that the skin grows from the inside out, right? Which means that most of the health and structure and function of the skin is coming from the inside. And the very top layers of the skin are really the dead layers, the stratum corneum, that it's not functioning really outside of acting as a barrier. So when you think about circulation, nutrients, stimulus and stimuli for building and repair, the function of the immune system, all of that comes from the inside out. And of course, all of that is then influenced by nutrient availability, which is a gut and gut microbiome function, and also how the immune system responds to stimulus on the skin, right? So what seems to be clear, and it's actually a bidirectional highway. When I talk about the gut-skin axis, there are very clear ways in which the gut influences the skin, but there's also now clear ways that how the skin can influence the gut and system, right? So we'll touch on both of those. So when you think about the gut-skin paradigm, so we'll just focus in on a couple of key nutrients, right? So one of the very important nutrients that exist on our skin that afford a very foundational function to our skin are these ceramides, right? These ceramides are these lipids. They're basically fats that act as like the motor in between the skin cells. So they stick all the skin cells together and they form a very good lipophilic barrier. So this is an oil-based barrier that then doesn't allow moisture, which is the water within the skin, to escape, right? That ceramide layer is very important in maintaining moisture, function, and structure to the skin. The other thing the ceramide layer does is it acts as a barrier for things penetrating through, right? Most toxins and all that tend to be oil soluble. And so they get wrapped up in the oil, and then the oil eventually sloughs off and gets metabolized on the top of the skin by the microbes. And that's how you kind of detox the skin through that ceramide oil barrier. Now, where do those ceramides come from? Obviously, they're not from the top. They all come from the gut and from the liver. So when we consume certain things like wheat germ, for example, or rice bran, another important reason why fiber is so critical, the microbes can convert some of the lipids in that into a type of lipid that your liver can then use to form human-based ceramides. And then those ceramides go to the skin and then get utilized there. Then if you think about, amino acids that we need for the skin, right? We know that collagen, so important for skin health, elastin, so important for skin health. Those are all proteins. Those proteins have to be metabolized in the gut by the help of the microbiome. And then the gut, with the help of the liver, assembles the proteins into the right carriers and sends that to the skin. So some of the materials to construct the skin and all that come from the gut. The other aspect of it that's really important is the immune response on the skin, right? The immune response in the skin and the immune response throughout the periphery of the body is heavily dictated by how the immune system is trained in the gut. So we can think of the gut as like the central command center of how the rest of the immune system works, because about 75% of all your immune sampling tissue in your body is found in your gut, right? That's where you encounter the vast majority of antigens from the environment, from your food and all that. And that's where decisions are being made as to what to attack and what not to attack. So this is a concept called oral tolerance, right? The concept of oral tolerance is it's really important for not only for your immune system to be able to protect you from things that could harm you, but equally important, and in some cases even more important, is for your immune system to not overreact to the vast majority of things that don't harm you, right? That can in fact cause more pathology and more dysfunction than a lack of reaction to something that could be harmful. And so as a result of that, there's a mechanism within our immune system, and this mechanism exists in the gut. And really not anywhere else in the immune system, that when these antigens come through, they get trapped in that mucosa, right? So that's that highly viscous moat. So they get trapped in there and they move very slowly through it. Now you've got immune cells, and on the other side of those soldiers, your intestinal epithelial cells called dendritic cells. The reason they're called dendritic cells is they have these long arms like dendrites that can stick in between those soldiers and reach into the moat and sample things that are coming through. So it's basically reaching in and sampling what's coming through and trying to make decisions whether or not that thing should be attacked, right? Now, when these dendritic cells are sampling the things in the moat, in the context of a healthy microbiome, meaning you've got high levels of secretory IgA, you've got high levels of short-chain fatty acids, low levels of inflammation, what the dendritic cell does is it encounters a thing and goes, aha, hey, T cell, which is a helper T cell, I'm going to activate you into a regulatory T cell, and I want you to remember that this is a thing we don't need to attack. Right? Wherever we encounter it in the body, we're not attacking it. So then the regulatory T cell sees that antigen, understands that, and goes around looking for any immune cells that may try to attack that antigen and suppresses that response. Now, let's say that dendritic cell reaches across the moat and encounters an antigen, but in this case, it's doing so in a dysfunctional microbiome, right? So you've got higher levels of inflammatory mediators in that space. You've got low short-chain fatty acids. You've got low secretory IgA. That context, the dendritic cell goes, it must be bad, right? Everything around here looks bad, so this must be bad too. And hey, T cell, we're not going to do a regulatory T cell. We're going to do a CD8, CD4 T cell and amplify an immune response against this thing, right? And that thing could just be a peanut protein, right? So now your immune system goes, anywhere we see this peanut protein, we're going after it, right? And so that is that decision tree that creates this loss of oral tolerance when you have a microbiome that's dysfunctional and the immune system is sampling things in that dysfunctional context. Now, why am I talking about that with skin? Well, because anytime we develop a loss of oral tolerance to things we're breathing in, like ragweed, pollen, things like that, when those things fall on your skin, your immune system is going to attack it, right? Because the gut immune system has dictated now that that's a bad thing, we're going to attack it. When microbes, certain types of microbes fall in your skin, your immune system is going to attack it. When food antigens fall in your skin, you could be at dinner eating and you could get a protein from food that falls in your skin, your immune system is going to attack it. And what's going to happen? The attack is going to cause a damage to the skin. It's going to cause something called dermatitis, which is like the early stages of eczema and so on. And you're going to get patches and potentially autoimmune responses and all that, right? So how the immune system responds to the presence of things touching the skin is dictated heavily by what's happening in the gut.
Well, that's a great analogy. And if people haven't figured out from today, your gut controls so many different things, then you've missed the boat. You've had some great analogies, and we've talked about almost every major body system, how the gut directly or indirectly affects that, and how keeping that initial gut healthy is so important to keep the immune system. I want to thank you so much for your time today. If people want to learn more about the research and stuff that you do, where can they find out more?
Yeah, they're welcome to follow me on Instagram and Facebook. So on Instagram, my handle is at Kiran Biome, KIRAN BIOME. And I think on Facebook, it's just Kiran Krishnan is how those handles work. And I post a lot on there about courses that I teach for consumers and practitioners. And then if they put my name into YouTube, they'll find lots and lots and lots of interviews and webinars and all that people have very kindly uploaded that I've done over the years. So there's an endless amount of education out there.
Well, you are an endless value and wealth. I will just tell you today, like you said, just hearing about the complex nature of how the gut affects the body, I can't thank you enough for drawing those really unique illustrations to make people understand. And I hope they share that with others, because I think that's so important. But I really want to thank you for being with me today.
It's my pleasure. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you, Karen. Have a great day.
You too.